Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a view that was around, when I was in very early high school, as the 1970s were coming to an end, around that time, and even into the 80s, I guess. But where it's just a class issue, but was transposed to race later on. If you take people from high crime areas and you sprinkle them in small numbers in more affluent areas, then the good behaviour vibes will rub off on them, and they'll become good citizens. The idea was that the ultimate purpose was to create a utopia, nirvana, where there were no such thing as poor people who behaved in a criminal manner. But the idea was, and with some merit, by the way, that if you took people out of the mean streets, the crime-ridden mean streets, and you put them into a low crime area where people didn't commit crimes, didn't think about committing crimes, and so on, so a low crime area, that eventually these people from the high crime area would adjust their behaviour and they would fit in with the people around them, and they would want to not commit crimes and have nicely manicured front lawns and so on. Now, the idea then was to put government housing. I think it's called Section 8 housing or something like that in the United States, but put government housing, that is, build apartment blocks and that sort of thing, or even put houses in, or townhouses into affluent areas and make them look exactly like the other houses and places in the area, but put in people from the mean streets. Now, that meant that they would be in areas where there was no crime. They wouldn't be close to or nearby any other criminals that they could relate to. And the children would go to schools where there was no, the children were well behaved, the other kids were well behaved, and where misbehaviour was something that really wasn't known, or understood in those sort of places, or certainly not to the extent it had been. Children attended school because that was what you did. You tried hard in your lessons and hitting the books and all that sort of stuff. And this would eventually make the criminal elements, it would turn them into good, upstanding citizens. So that was the idea. Now, it actually had some success. It was a very expensive scheme, and you couldn't have people more than 1,000 meters sort of, you had to separate and widely sprinkle these criminal elements around. So you could only deal with a relatively small number, really. Now, they would pick the worst cases rather than the ones most likely to benefit from such a scheme. So families that were constantly in trouble would be moved into their areas. Now, it did have some success, but they could only really move a small number from the mean streets and put them in and around the more affluent, better behaved areas. But all the building of these places around and the cost and the main sort, it was a massively expensive scheme, and there were some results. You couldn't say it was a failure. Excuse me, it was a mixed bag, so maybe 50-50 in the overall scheme of things. So again, nor would you say it was a crowning success, but it did have some success. So, and if it's something, that more people are heading and going into the mean streets, then you can put into these schemes and programs. And it's typically done at state rather than federal level. But now this attitude, though, this view that if you just move people in, their behaviour will change, they then they went to the next stage in order to sort of up the ante and get some more numbers through. And they then put people from the mean streets, they take over entire apartment blocks and into an affluent area, and they put the whole block with folks from the mean streets. And that was a rousing failure because these people were in a small island of crime within an island of well-behaved, and it just meant that the police were around every day. The sort of criminal behaviour wasn't tolerated, so they ended up spending more time in prison and these sorts of things. And social services were taking children away from parents. Whereas if they'd stayed in the mean streets, they probably would have been more left alone as long as they were only annoying each other. But now they were annoying, committing crimes against the good folk of the community. So the police response was more heavy-handed, as you would imagine. So that failed. And the once you move a whole bunch of people into an area, even if it's sort of 10 apartments in the block and they're all from the mean streets, and they tend to still reinforce each other's behaviour and still see crime and misbehaviour as the way things are done, even though they may be. And in school, they're just a disruptive element, and they're constantly on detention or being expelled. So nothing's achieved there either. So again, it came down to, in small numbers, it would work or would work most of the time. But anything above small numbers, as in, one family, in an area, then another mile away, another family, and spread out amongst, when it was done on that basis, small numbers widely spread, so they couldn't get together, then it did work. But given such small numbers and the expense of it, that was considered to be. So in the end, the whole thing was really abandoned in the end, and so. But that attitude prevailed when it came to the thinking about migration. The view, and I remember this, the view that some politicians and other social commentators were putting about back in the 80s was that, well, we can bring migrants in and they'll start, after a while, they'll just start behaving like us. So their attitudes, their behaviours, their interactions, they'll adopt all the Western attitudes, and they'll become good white Western citizens in a behavioural sense, at least, or an attitudinal and behavioural sense. And so that was something that prevailed. Now, I think that's hung over into the mass migration, which is a absolute folly, by the way, to think that people brought in anything other than the small numbers won't change at all. Now, if you look at the behaviour of Black Americans, for example, or Black Caribbeans, it doesn't matter, and look at the behaviour of Black Africans, even though those people have been out of Africa for 200, 300, 400, 500 years in some cases, the behaviour that they display is still the same, more or less, as the behaviour in Africa. So really nothing much has changed. So they've been in white societies for hundreds of years. And sure, some have acclimatized, or some have become more white and so on, but really you couldn't call it a success. Look at the inner city areas of Chicago and Baltimore and so on. The 20, 30 people are shot and murdered each weekend. This sort of stuff. How is that possible? How is it possible to be in another society, instead of Africa, in a white society, the United States, and be there for hundreds of years, and you still behave the same as was the case in Africa? So clearly the idea of people being moved from one culture and behavioural situation into another doesn't mean they'll change their behaviour at all. Some will, sure, but the idea that the majority will, or 90%, they won't. The numbers that do change their behaviours to fit in with new society are very small. Now, we can also say the same thing with, say, India. Now, the Indians have a fanatical view, or many do, nearly all do, on spiritual and racial purity, and they adopt these positions with much vigour. So they're not going to integrate into the new society. Now, they may give up Buddhism or something like that, or observe it less fervently, but they're even after 5, 6, 7 generations in the West, they're still sending back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides. They're still living very much in India. They still only want to spend money with other Indians. They'll only buy their motor vehicles from the motor vehicle dealership down the road's owned by an Indian. They'll only want to spend their money at Indian shops, and so now they still may buy some groceries at the national grocery chain, but only if they have to. So they're very determined not to share any of their money with the white people, the host population, and they want to keep the money within their own racial diaspora. Now we can go through other groups, Chinese people that came to Australia in the the 1850s with the gold rush, or the Chinese people that came to America to help build that transnational railroad going from the east to the west coast, all that sort of stuff. The Chinese still, and in Australia too, there's still a large cohort of Chinese who will only marry other Chinese. They still speak with a very clipped, very noticeably clipped accent when they speak English. English is still their second language, even though their families or antecedents have been in Australia for 170 years. So the integration rate is, I'm not talking just integration. You could talk of behavioural integration, attitudinal integration. You could talk those sorts of things. But they're not really changing either. You still see the very obvious Chinese behaviour, even to the way some of these people walk. They walk with a Chinese walk, even though they've lived in Australia generations. They've been in Australia for, again, 170 years. So this idea of attitude change, behavioural change, I don't know how long it takes. I mean, do we talk, decades, centuries, thousands of years? What creates the ultimate sort of attitudinal integration and behavioural integration? If it takes thousands of years, I mean, we're on a difficult path here. The West is being hollowed out. With I don't know how much is going to be left in 100 years, the way it's currently going. But the integration experiment, the multicultural experiment, the mass immigration experiment has failed horribly failed. Not just slightly, but horribly. And the people who came into the West, in the earlier stages of the mass migration, the 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, and earlier still, again, the Indians, 170 years ago, 180 years ago, they're not integrating. I mean, some are, but in small numbers and very slowly. The Indian rate of integration into the West, even after 5 or 6 generations, is still like 2%. It's very small. And it's not just the racial integration, that you could sort of put to one side maybe, but the attitudinal integration, the idea of, for example, Indians who've been in Australia for multiple generations now, or in the West, they still have that Indian view that there's only one pot of money, fixed pot of money in the world. The only way you can get more of it is by deceiving others. South Americans as well think that way, many of them. So very, very few have this concept, or they understand about building and creating wealth. They just don't understand it. And even though they've been in the West for hundreds of years, as in their previous generations, they still don't get it. It's still a case of you've got to deceive the other guy and get his money, and that shows how clever you are. Look how many people I've deceived today. Wow, I'm a kick-ass businessman. And same from the Middle East. I was talking to a guy a while, a businessman from the Middle East, and he claims his greatest skill was a negotiator. And now he didn't come across as very bright or clever to me, so I was sort of listening to him. And well, what do you mean? And he said, well, when I do business with people, I make them think they got half the cake when really they only got a quarter of the cake. And so that makes me a kick-ass businessman. It does. Now that attitude is very Middle Eastern. But the guy again has been in Australia. His parents were born in Australia. His grandparents came to Australia as teenagers. So he marries into the Middle Eastern sort of diaspora. The Arabic diaspora. So again, he's displaying the attitudes and views that are common in somewhere I don't know, like fucking Lebanon or something. But he's got no concept of, or seems to have no concept of what attitudes are in Australia. So the host culture has had very little effect on him. If the host culture is just a bunch of glittery gold, baubles for him to grab hold of, that's all. Beyond that, it's got nothing. And most of these cultures coming in, whether it be Indian or whatever, take a dim view of Western culture. It's whether they see it as decadent on one side, or the blacks see it as weak and effeminate, or the Indians see it as culturally and spiritually inferior, and so on. So there's these new cultures coming in. Not only are they not adopting Western culture, but they're viewing it with disdain, if not contempt, and derision. So the Western values aren't they're working at a job, working 9 to 5, saving your money, buying the house, having the family, all these sort of things that once were staple bedrock Western values, being, by the way, viciously attacked and undermined by the globalists, and that we need to consider. But there's no host culture. Increasingly, there's no host culture for these imports to adapt to, and they're now coming, and have been for some time now, coming over in numbers so large that they can form and do form and have formed and are forming their own racial enclaves. And why would they give a fuck about the host culture? All the host culture offers them is money for them to take, and they're definitely not in the business of sharing it with white people. Definitely in the business of taking it from the host culture. They just see the host culture as a rich, decaying, decadent piece of shit that they can take from as much as they want, whenever they want, and can do so with impunity, which is hardly making the host richer. It's instead turning the host into a hollowed out shell of what it once was. But I did want to highlight this idea of, can small numbers of people inserted into a host culture, can they change, or most of them at least, change their behavior and attitudes? Again, we're not talking just straight mixed race marriages or something here. We're talking behavioral and attitudinal cultural change, and this is what is not happening. And if anything, it's going into hard reverse. And so this attitude, or this view, this ideology, call it what you will, of putting folks from the mean streets into the more affluent areas, and that would change them, that has that attitude, that view, hung over into importing folks from other very, very different cultures. It's a whole different ball game. If, say, in Australia, for example, you import people from Britain, or from Western Europe. You've got the white sort of tradition of the big city, urbanized, the concept of education and work and type of living, the way you live your life, and Christian, and this sort of thing, how social relations are conducted, all that sort of stuff. And so these people integrate fairly quickly. Once you move away from that, then even Greeks and Italians, particularly if they were the sort of more rural peasant stock from the rural farming areas, even they take 4 generations to integrate fully into the behavioural side of things. They do so more quickly than folks would from other cultures, but still. So there's only a small group of a nucleus of white West European nations, Christian, where integration between them is fairly swift. Germans, for example, they're pretty much the first generation Australian born are Australian, or if they come over to Australia as young children, they integrate within their lifetime. But this starry-eyed view, this nirvana of how you can socially engineer behaviour to create a nirvana, has some merit when the numbers are very small, but beyond that, it's a total failure. And I think that's where we are now. You've been with Tassos today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.